to give us a little discipline, I would like to ask the panel to comment from different vantage points. And I have fairly big brains here next to me, and as I've had a big brain day with a lot of people humor me here, I'm trying to keep up with these guys. But first of all, to the very right, we have Greg Rosston, Director of the Public Policy Program and a Senior Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, a Professor of Economics at Stanford, who used to be, or was, the Deputy Chief Economist of the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, working on the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which is a big paradigm changer here in the United States. He was also the senior economist for transactions in the Federal Communications Commission during the AT&T T-Mobile transaction, and co-chaired economy, globalization, and trade under Obama, being part of the transition team on Obama's team as well. So that's Greg. Greg is going to come at it from an economics angle. And then to his immediate, I guess to your immediate left, Greg, is my friend Ken Kushida, who is the Japan Program Research Scholar at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford, a project leader for the New Japan Project, and also an International Research Fellow at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies. Ken and I know each other from our collaboration at the UC Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy, where we're looking at tech and political economics, the future of work, the global platform economy, and things like that. And then we have somebody who I owe a debt of gratitude because he was my moderator when we introduced the book, so I'm repaying the debt now. Quentin Hardy, head of editorial at Google Cloud. And if you're wondering what that is, I'm sure he can tell you plenty about it, but it's essentially about writing about the ways that cloud computing technology, including and by extension artificial intelligence and or greater computer intelligence, is reshaping business and society. Quentin came to Google having been the deputy technology editor at the New York Times, the famed New York Times, and was a national editor at Forbes Media, Wall Street Journal in both Asia and the US, so he has experience living and working in Asia as well. And Quentin is obviously very well-rounded by way of his professional background. We're going to rely on him to maybe give us the specific tech sector perspective on what do we need to do as executives, how do we work with government to fix this thing, right? So Greg, if I could rely on you to give us a few minutes of your perspective as an economist.
Sure. So I think Anya's introduction was great. As a naive economist, as Quentin said, it's really scary to think about things. As economists and academics, we tend to think much more theoretically, but we do have a theory of what people do. When you enter into agreements with others, you want to understand the constraints of the agreement, the legal constraints that you put on the agreement, the regime that you're going to be operating under. You want to understand your partners' incentives, your customers' incentives, your rivals' incentives. All these things are important to understand for making your short and long run investment decisions. And then this allows you to engage in contracts and trade. Trade is kind of just, we have trade of companies between California and Nevada, but we also have trade between Mountain View and Palo Alto and between Silicon Valley and China and Germany. So trade happens all the time, and people shouldn't willingly enter into trade agreements unless they think they are going to profit from this trade. We hear a lot about trade in a different perspective, which is that people are hurt by trade, and these are people who are not necessarily parties to these agreements. That's why we have lots of opposition, is that people who are not parties to the trade agreements can get hurt. So when we think about someone selling grain, they're going to benefit if they want to sell it, so they're going to enter into it. The difference is that that there are also issues where the government gets involved. And it's not necessarily just two companies that can make exchanges and both benefit from it, whether they're here or there, but the governments get involved. And as you think about government getting involved to prevent trade in times because they want to protect their own industries, they want to protect employment, they may also have, these things may be in a democracy, you want to make sure that your people who vote and their incentives may not be economic efficiency, but maybe jobs, or maybe national security, or maybe the government is looking at the benefits, as Anya said, of clean energy technology. And we want to make sure that we have the ability to provide that sort of thing. So trying to think about these things in a trade framework is really important. Where the government can come in and do things is concerning if, she listed 4 things as threats from China. She listed spying. She listed forced intellectual property. She listed investments and students and the coercion of students. 2 of those scare me to death: the spying and the forcing students to spy. The other 2, investing in companies, well, I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing. I think it tends to be good. If you provide capital to someone with a good idea, that's probably good. And if you, the question of forced intellectual property, if you say to me, well, we're going to do a deal, and part of that deal is that I'm going to buy your intellectual property, and maybe you're going to have to give me your intellectual property if you have access to my market. That may be something that you're willingly entering into a negotiation and a trade, and you think you're going to be better off. So economists tend to think about this differently than national security people. So in the end, I think what we want to try and think about is how we can come together on these issues with thinking about dealing with people who are upstream or downstream in what economists call vertical relationships, and what are their incentives to take over your part of the vertical relationship chain, and how that's going to work in the short and medium long run. If they take away your intellectual property, you may be under threats. You may say, well, I'm not going to enter this agreement. You may agree with somebody else. So this is where I think that, where Huawei is being banned in the United States, there's opportunities for other companies. It may, to come in and replace Huawei, so they may take a benefit from that. I think I've gone on for my 3 minutes or so, so I'll...
Oh, it's all good. So that's sort of the explanation as to how economists look at problems like this differently. Now let's look at the implications of what is happening. Okay, the implications seem to be that we may be pushing China, frankly, more deeply into the Made in China 2025 policy, where they're saying, look, I have to be more self-sufficient, less dependent on U.S. goods. From an economist, from an economic standpoint, where does this lead us if we keep playing this game?
I mean, this is where if we say, that if we deny China the right to certain technologies from the United States, they have very, very smart people working on the same things. They may be able to develop other technology, and it provides them more of an incentive to develop this alternative technology to substitute around us. So I think that's a concern that we need to have when we ban sales of our stuff to them. Selling our stuff to them, they may be able to reverse engineer it, but if we don't sell it to them, they may be able to engineer it themselves. And that's a question that you need to think about in terms of trying to worry about a ban in security. The same thing is true where if we ban the importation of their goods, they may find other markets, and also, but we do have the advantage of trying to develop our own technology, or technology from countries we trust more.
Yeah, and in fact, that's actually already been happening. There are statistics out there that prove that these are trends, right? Okay, so what would you suggest we do about it?
That's way
as an economist.
I mean, this is, that I think, be wary of what you are, make sure and try and get as much clarity and insight into what the possibilities are and how these trade-offs are made. As an economist, I don't know enough about the technology to understand whether, for example, Huawei's 5G equipment is going to spy on our networks or not. I just, I have to rely on other people to worry about that. If it does have embedded stuff in it, I really don't think it's a good idea for us to have that in our telecom networks. But if it's something that, for example, the British have looked at it and they think it's less of a threat than we do, or do they have different incentives, or are they just more naive, or do they understand the technology better? I don't know, and I think you have to rely on technologists and not people who understand the technology to figure out what is safe and what is not. But in general, I think we should try as much as possible to allow trade and allow to build these relationships, because people benefit a lot from the introduction of technology and the introduction of seamless relationships, vertical relationships.
There's one thing that Anya said, right, that as an economist must make you cringe, I suppose, but you can set me straight on that. She said, don't just focus on the economic side of growing a company into a unicorn, also be a patriot, right? That's on one hand, as a former US State Department official, is an understandable thing to say. On the other hand, for an economist, that is troubling because, is that really what you want to put into the foreground, right? Does it, because you could flip this as well. You could then say, well, maybe President Trump, and we don't know, nobody from the White House is here, made this decision to block Huawei, yes, maybe also because of spying, but maybe primarily because, frankly, there is no alternative US supplier of 5G equipment, air access equipment like Huawei is making. Maybe he was buying time, holding the Chinese up so that we could develop our own competitors in the market.
Right. I think that there are lots of other ways. Now I'm going to stray away from being an economist. That there are lots of things that you can say that a company may or may not want to do as a company for human rights issues or other things like that that you may think is supporting repressive governments or things like that. That a patriot may she may be thinking of it in those terms as well. That didn't make me cringe as much as an economist. For the parts that you rightly bring up as protectionism, I don't like that. I'd rather, I think that consumers benefit a lot from more efficient trade, and we should have that from cheaper iPhones. We benefit a lot from that.
So purely as an economist, you would say the United States should not seek to become technology self-sufficient in what the Chinese have to offer, right? I mean, leaving the spying aside, national security, as a pure economist, you would say that's harmful.
Right, absolutely. From not only China, but lots of other countries around the world that we benefit from the trade and from their know-how, and they benefit from ours.
Right. Okay, let me take it then more into the political realm, right? You started to take us there, Greg. Yeah. Ken, you have experience in and with Asia. We've had many projects in which you brought this to the table. What's really going on over there? Like, what are the interests at stake?
So let me first give you a framework and then run through a couple of cases, because I think it was quite a provocative. Am I projecting okay? Okay. A video that a lot of us have responses to. So first, the framework, right? Technological development, which trajectory it's going to follow, and how it diffuses is, as we know, shaped by regulations, right? If it's legal one place but not legal another place, it will go very rapidly in a direction that's not legal in the place where it's not illegal. So that kind of thing happens. What shapes the regulations is politics. And politics shape the regulations, which shape which directions the technology go. We've already talked about this in the past 2 days, but it's going to happen very differently in different parts of the world, and we're already beginning to see that. Now, politics. Politics is about power. Winners and losers. Who are the current winners and who are the potential losers? These are the places that often make the biggest political impact. But every country is different, and every region like the EU is different on how those interests are aggregated. If you're a potential loser, what are the levers you have to affect policy and regulations? If you're a potential winner or a current winner, how can you either preserve the status quo or try to prevent changes from happening? So, with all of that in mind, then if we think about it, we have to go down to the level of how value is created by these various new technologies in order to figure out who the potential winners and losers are, to understand the political dynamics, which then shape the next round of technologies. So, first of all, let's talk about supply chains, because that's what the title of this was. And given the previous couple sessions, I'm going to adjust a little bit what I said. But historically, there were multiple Asian supply networks done by different types of countries that looked very different. Japanese production networks were largely closed. They looked into Asia for lower end. They fed into the higher value added in Japan, and then it was for the Japanese market and then for global markets through Japan. The Silicon Valley production networks that grew after the 90s were very much harnessing improvements in the Asian suppliers, so that instead of consigning them to lower end, it was a conscious effort to open up the supplier networks so that the companies here could boomerang on the rapid improvements by the Asian suppliers, who are free to produce for not only the US market and the ones that they were subcontracting from, but their own domestic markets and cultivating their own networks. There were very different overlapping sets of supplier networks in Asia. So from the video, we went all the way back to the early post-war era, the space race, but we're talking much more recently. We're already talking about supplier networks harnessing the rapid improvements in Asia so that without them improving rapidly, we here, sitting right here, cannot improve at the pace that we have been. The intertwining is not something that's recent, it's deeply, deeply enmeshed. So changing any of these, we're talking about big winners and big potential losers. Who were they? And I think Olaf is absolutely right to look into for 5G. Well, we didn't have a big US potential loser who is creating and manufacturing 5G equipment, who shutting down Huawei would be an absolute plus for. Hence, it's a safer target. But then let's shift to talk about 5G a little bit, because there's a lot of confusion in the press and hype, and I don't want you to go down that road either. What is the value creation of 5G? It's not in the 5G networks itself, right? Those are essentially thick pipes. Yes, it's a big market because there has to be a lot of infrastructure investment for it, so there will be a lot of purchasing being done and people selling into that. Yes, potential demand, but really, is 5G a fundamental potential transformation of the industrial structure, like pre-internet and post-internet? Or is it something that's going to probably strengthen existing big giants, Amazon, Google down the street, et cetera? Are they going to be served most by having thick pipes? Or if we run to something capital intensive, infrastructure investment in China, that's going to happen first in China, then until 5G gets built out everywhere else, everything within China that requires 5G to function will not function elsewhere. You have automated driving that requires 5G in China, there's no 5G elsewhere for a while, those automated driving solutions won't be portable elsewhere. So now if we think of the US, how fast do you think these telcos will build very costly infrastructure investment from 5G when they might not be receiving that much benefit? Because are they going to charge a lot for the big bandwidth? Are they going to charge exponentially more than they are now? Or are people going to try to figure out how to send less data first? And if you're building an autonomous driving solution, is it better in the US if you're going to build one that doesn't require 5G networks, so that if you pass through some area, we've all had cell phones drop, but then it's a lot of infrastructure investment to get 5G that won't drop. Well, you don't want your autopilot to shut off. So which direction are we heading in here? So there is a great potential, looking at this way, and I'm going to build it through the framework, and that's it for me, where within China, through 5G, things like IoT, et cetera, that there's a lot of hype around, you can do things in China that cannot be done elsewhere. What's the mechanism by which the rest of us benefit from that? Well, the directly moving things that require 5G to places that don't have 5G won't work. But new types of value creation. Are you going to build algorithms using data that you can only get through there? Are you going to have manufactured products that you can only make because the factory is 5G enabled? If that's the case, you probably want them as your supplier. Who are going to be the winners and losers in this case? That's where we have to take it to the next step. From there, the aggregation is who are the potential winners and losers in, let's say, the US versus, let's say, Germany, let's say other parts of the EU, to figure out if we're going to create a structure that's going to have multiple flavors of 5G, places that will have no 5G for a while. Probably that's where I put my, well, I don't have money, but if I had money, I'd put it on in the US, that they won't have full 5G soon. And then other parts, Asia, Japan. Japan's not going to follow the Chinese 5G because they don't want to have that kind of dependent relationship. So if we're looking at a heterogeneous world, who are the winners and losers? Those of you in Germany or working here are the ones that in technology are likely to see earlier than the rest, but don't get caught in the hype of 5G is going to suddenly unlock all this value. We've seen that in many other places, and the networks usually just don't do that. It's who uses the networks.
Let me maybe.
My work here is done.
Yeah, if you followed that, you definitely deserve that drink. That was very, very sophisticated. And let me try to bring it to a certain point. I think what you're also saying is we are, with this trade war and with these mutual blockades, we're fragmenting the global economy. Those scale effects are hurting everybody, and they're probably going to hurt us here first when it comes to 5G rollout. So what do we do this? How do we tackle this from a political economist point of view? What are we going to do about this?
So part of it is that it's actually not fragmenting to the direction that to the level that we think it is, right? Because some Microsoft executives told me that they would never put source code through Chinese physical networks. This was some years ago when those conversations made sense.
Right.
So, and of course, big companies like Japanese company Komatsu that has diggers, all the diggers in the world has sensors all over them. They know what's being used. If fuel is decreasing without actually the machine running, you know somebody's siphoning the fuel, et cetera. They know everywhere except China is a big black box because you literally cannot take the data out of there. If you go to their Chinese office, you can see all of China because it's within China and you can do that. But these networks don't interconnect. So we already have several layers of physical goods moving around very fast, systems that are similar, but you don't use the same data because the data can't move across, things developing within China that can only develop within China, and then things that can diffuse freely outside of China because people are not interested or for many reasons not bringing it in there. So we already have this kind of picture going. Now moving forward, the question is, where do we look at to see if this fragmentation is going to go deeper? Because personal data used for AI training runs is different, or if it's going to be less relevant, because once you make the algorithm in China using Chinese data, then just moving the algorithm across, you're not moving the actual data, it's just the algorithm of how to use other people's data. So what's the mechanism of adjustment? That's where I would look to try to figure out where to react to.
Okay, thank you. I want to take pause now and do two things. First of all, I would like you to open up the app that you have and leave us questions on the app, please. Since we have to be fairly compact with the Q&A, we're going to go back to that mechanism now, and we can see them in front of us here on the screen. And the second thing I want to do is I want to now kick it over to my friend Quentin, who obviously can comment on pretty much everything that was said here, but I want to take him a specific view of, somebody who works at a tech company, looking at it through the eyes of a tech company. He's covered tech for a long time. How do you look at this? What do we do with this mess? Is this the brave new world that we're living in?
First off, it's incumbent on me to safe harbor myself at this point and state that nothing I say here reflects any policy of Google. These are totally my opinions.
Yeah, fair enough.
I work in tech. I've been around tech a long time, many, many different kinds of standards wars. But let me begin by, this is like we're going down the line talking about which part of the video made our head explode. Now, which part of the video made my head explode, you might have thought was the one about let's not make unicorns, let's be patriots.
Yeah.
Because that's just about as squishy as it gets. I can go around this room and get about, I'd say 50 different definitions of what patriotism is. So that means nothing, okay? But what really made my head explode was where she said, we used to dictate the values and standards of technology, but we don't. As if China does? I mean, what does that mean, right? Okay, so that's what made my head explode. We don't dictate the standards. We build stuff people want to buy. We do what they call around here product market fit, right? So let's talk about 5G for just a sec, because I'm not sure everybody knows exactly what this stuff is, except it's like super important. So let's just step back and talk about what 5G is. 5G is essentially using microwaves and smaller cells than the standard longer wave big cells that we're using now for our smartphones and our IoT sensors and all this other stuff. And so it's like these tiny little microcells everywhere. And what's great about that is you can have these picocells that support 1 million devices per square kilometer. Currently, we can support about 100,000 devices per square kilometer, 10x the number of devices. Sounds great. Also faster. We tend to like fast bandwidth. Also great. So it sounds pretty good. But let's get into some use cases, because it's about product market fit. That's what businesses look at. Like, can I make a buck here? Not to put too fancy a phrase on it, right? And, when you get into this, what's it going to deliver? Well, IoT, that sounds good. Robotics, because locally you can kind of manage a whole lot of robots on a factory. That sounds good. Maybe some VR and AR. That sounds good. But what's the business case? This is kind of what you're saying. Like, we don't know what any of that is worth, right? And in terms of factories, German manufacturers, they may want 5G, but I tell you about IoT and robotics, and it's like jobs, privacy. Oh man, let's not do that. Let's just build really fantastic products people will pay a premium for, right? That's where they're going to go. And so it is an unspoken use case. Like we are not sure what this stuff is worth. So a rollout, highly doubtful in this case. Maybe we'll move into it and find those things. But again, if it happens in China, which it appears to be doing largely as industrial policy, not because it's a surefire way to make a buck, will those lessons pertain elsewhere? Now, I'm not saying it's not going to happen, and Siemens makes this stuff too, and Nokia makes this stuff too, and they'll probably make it highly dependable, and over time, every bit as good as what Huawei is doing. Another thing that made my head explode. If you steal intellectual property, you do not become a leader, you become a fast follower. Like, that is not how you innovate at the leading edge, by stealing, because you've got the other guy's stuff, You get the picture? So just a few problems with that argument. Anyway, but I think what's positive to talk about is the signal dimensions of the modern age, of the digital age, if you will, are speed and scale. Like, that's really what's steering things. We can do things, as somebody at a chip company said, this is the first time in history where you can make something and easily envision selling 100 million of it right out of the gate. That's just a whole different world. And of course, the speed of change, as more and more people are connected and more data sets are shared online, is also radically improving. And this is like a whole other talk we could have. And on that level, 5G is interesting, but it is not a proven business case.
Okay, so now from a tech business angle, though, how do we neutralize these political concerns? If we all agree that we need some kind of piping, what's the way to go here? How do we do this? Some international audits on the stuff is clean, it's working as it should, there's no government interference.
You know what worries me much more than that is a kind of balkanization, which is happening politically, that is affecting the politics of Italy, the politics of Britain, the politics of America, not so much Germany yet, but then Hungary, up and down Eastern Europe. China's a given. It's a very nationalistic place in its policies. And that means more and more barriers and more local regulations. And one of the things that people were talking about in the last session on medical was essentially, tell us the rules, and we'll try and make a buck inside them, right? Businesses want the maximal product market fit inside the rules. And the more places there are different rules, the more problem you're going to have achieving that. That will argue against speed and scale. So that kind of nationalistic balkanization of regulations is a bigger worry to me than any particular supply chain
Really, what
problem.
you're saying with that, though, is that the answer has to be political, because that's what really leads to the balkanization, right? So what do we do as business leaders about that?
If you try and walk the cat back up and see how we got here in terms of all this nationalism and protectionism, you might take it back to the 2008 crash, and that, how globalization and boundaryless financial markets put the world on its knees and set up all this retreat and all this nationalistic fear. And we got to move through that, and we got to show good, and we got to reach consensus through positive growth that is more equitable.
Which frankly also goes to what Greg was saying earlier, and I see some reactions to that here on the screen. Greg, you were talking about winners and losers, right? So in the 7 to 11 crisis, we produced a bunch of losers. Can you just clarify, maybe, when you talk about winners and losers, you talk about it in economic terms as an economist. It's not a value judgment.
So when I was talking about winners and losers, I meant that people who engage in trade and trade with each other, we're going to have a benefit to it. But there could be externalities, that somebody else loses their job because of what we do. So that's what somebody who's not party to the agreement can get hurt by an agreement. Same thing, there's a question about environmental damages caused by 5G. This could be an externality of people who are not using 5G, or it's not priced into it. So economists always worry, at least on the top, about externalities and how this affects other parties that's not priced into the deal. So that's what I think about when I think about losers, is people who are not party to a deal. Because if you're party to a deal and you're a loser, that's because you didn't go into it willingly, or you expected to win at the start and it didn't turn out your way.
So somebody needs to cut you a deal to bring you into the fold or make you whole.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's back to the political side. We have a question here at the top that says, how do you convince China to work with the rest of the world during the fourth industrial revolution? What kind of deal do we need to cut with China and for China to make this equitable, right, for both sides, to bring them into the fold, or to have them comply with these global rules that we have known, or is that era over?
So I think, to have China work with the rest of the world, in some sense, is the converse of what they're doing right now in terms of saying, you have to give us your intellectual property to play in our market. You have to play by these rules and you have to have sort of a large percentage of the world, the rest of the world, to agree that these are the rules. As Anya said, we need to have this, whatever it was, group of 10. I think that was something that did not make my head explode. It was something that was important, is if you really want to get people involved and on the same page, you have to have it so that people don't break away and do side deals and let it go in, and that China will see that the way to be profitable, because that's a lot of what they care about in international trade, is not just world domination, but they can't do it if they don't sell stuff. And they need to be part of the market and play by the same rules. And an international set of rules is how I would set it up.
Yeah. What do you think, Kenji?
Yeah,
Doable?
if I could address some of those parts too, and supplement what you were saying. So, winners and losers. So let's take the US automobile emission standards, right? That's clearly to protect the current automakers from getting disrupted by a fast move towards batteries and electric vehicles, which is why California wants to go ahead and move ahead. We've got Tesla, it's fine. California has some problems like what's happening today, fires. More electric might be good. But the current administration is pulling back California's strict emissions, and even going to the point that they're saying that California is not allowed to make their own rules more strict than the federal government. So who's the potential loser, and why are we doing this? There are potential winners, but not as big as the big potential losers, which is why the losers are fighting. In this case, the auto big firms, and then parts of strong oil, etc. So then let's move to intellectual property and bringing China into the fold. So while it's better strategy for a lot of firms to copy and bring into the domestic market, then they are the winners for doing that. However, we're at an inflection point, I think. Because, so if you go to one of these hotels in China now that's owned by, let's say, Tencent, the vending machine, if you're in the hotel, is facial recognition. Your room key is facial recognition. Except if you don't have the Chinese national ID, you can't actually buy something at the vending machine because you don't have the national ID number, which is what is the backstop for this transaction for your credit score. They're already well ahead of the rest of us. Now, the interesting part is some of the quiet talks that I hear were happening behind the latest round of Huawei sort of talks dying down, was that some of the big Chinese IT players are quietly becoming okay with IP protections because that's going to serve their interests. They are already leaders in many areas, and they would prefer that their IP not be stolen by anybody else. So in the medium run, short to medium run, they will be served by stronger domestic IP laws and protections because it serves their interests. They're moving to the winner position. We saw a less exaggerated version of this with Japan decades ago, where there were very loose patent laws, patent laws and whatnot. But then, as it grew, then they preferred to have stronger IP protection because it served them, because they had made this switch. And I think we're on the cusp of that.
So 2 small points about how do we bring China into the fold? Considering they are third of the world's population, they might find that a presumptuous question. Additionally, I'm reminded of the psychiatrist's line that the patient has to want to change. And looking at the intransigence of the party against the people in Hong Kong, I'm not getting a really strong signal that that's something that's going to happen.
So really, what you're saying is we might be looking at a bifurcation of the global system where one part plays to the Chinese rules and one part plays by the old rules, and we have two sets of rules to play with. Because that's 1.5 billion Chinese, that's a huge market.
Let 100 flowers bloom.
Yeah.
They'll be there, there'll be others there. Are they gonna, maybe nobody dominates, maybe we just compete.
Which sort of goes to your point earlier, Kenji, that look, we've been there in a way with Japan before. Now we're talking about China. There could be another country, I don't know what that would be, India, if it gets its act straight. There's others that are coming up, and we might be facing the same issues over again. How do we solve it in the Japan case? Could we learn lessons from that?
There are many lessons to be learned from the experience of Japan. Whether who learned what is another question. But the pattern that we saw in Japan was, the problem was that Japan was big, but not big enough. So you had leaders. They led in many ways when the technological trajectory was clear. But at the end of the day, there weren't any followers. So they were leaders without followers. This is not a very good leadership model. But China is big. So they can lead, and China's big enough, and this is a question, is it big enough that they can lead without following in various trajectories, like using 5G for various things, which does lead us to the pain point. What's the pain point that 5G is going to solve? And it could be a political pain point, where if the Chinese government, so if we go back to Hong Kong, right, because power, Communist Party wants to stay in power. That's the underlying. So Hong Kong, if you let it go too much, then they can undermine things. But if you clamp down too much, then other bad things happen. What's the line here? But they need to stay in power. So you've got to grow the economy to stay in power. You have to have bold strategies and do lots of different things to try to make sure the economy is going to be okay. Capital investment on a massive scale on new infrastructure is the oldest play in the book to keep the parts of the economy growing that could. If you get technological advancement there, that's great. If they become a leader and the rest of us followers, that's fine too. But it goes back to what the calculus is there. And as you say, it very much could be, Amazon just announced that low battery consumption wireless protocol, right? Because if you want, you don't want 5G in its current form in your glasses because the battery will be too heavy until battery innovation happens. But this very, very narrow band, tiny bit of data, but that's all the data you need to transfer is what Amazon put into some of its new devices. Maybe that's the direction it's going to go, and China's going to end up investing so much very costly 5G, not find a very good usage case, but then the hypothesis that then they can find the next big thing, infrastructure, to invest in. But you have to keep doing that for the Communist Party to stay in power.
Another interesting dimension of this we didn't mention and should is when we talk about bringing them into the fold, it is a fold that largely includes certain countries in the Northern Hemisphere, okay? It's not a fold that includes Africa. That's a big place. And China's doing some really interesting things in the Belt and Road Initiative to bring them into a technological and business relationship that may ultimately challenge the aging North. Fine. I actually wrote about Huawei in 2005, I think, because they had been selling in Africa for ages, and the quality wasn't very good, but it was super affordable. That's their strategy, typically, historically. And they'd gone up through all of Africa and done cell stations there and servers. And then they were in the Middle East, and they had just done their first sale into Spain when I did that. And it's almost like that industrial policy is attempting to be replicated in the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're bringing in West Asia and Africa and eventually maybe parts of Eastern Europe. And they bought the part of Piraeus, of course. And there may be a whole other kind of supply chain and technology axis developing in that direction as well.
Well, I want to address this next question that you see on the screen, and then also one other that I think makes the point about what the path is for us to solve this jointly with China. But it doesn't matter that we as a transatlantic alliance put our heads around this. It doesn't matter that we cooperate on this. Is there a case to be made that that's the right path to go?
Cooperation is always a good idea.
Why would it matter that Germany and the United States, or Europe and the United States, cooperate on this?
Well, I think it depends from my perspective on, this, as Anya said, of the idea of this getting a big enough market, essentially, that would then have leverage in this. And that depends in part on what are the economies of scale of building 5G equipment, building 5G networks, and what rides on top of them for kinds of things. I think, we didn't know what was going to happen on 4G networks, and we got Uber and other things that Google Maps that really work well on 4G networks that didn't work really well before. We don't know what's going to work on 5G networks and what's going to happen on the end of it. That's just, as Quentin said, just a pipe. And it's going to be a pipe to a lot of places, but the real value for consumers is not, I got faster stuff, it's what's the new stuff I'm going to get. And these things are, having lots of minds working on them together is going to help. And I think you want to have a bigger market, you want to have bigger clout, and you're working together to try to do this setting standards as well.
Setting standards in many ways, and for a large, you said it, for a large-scale market, between Europe and the United States, we have about 850 million internet users. That is not even close to China just yet. The internet users are approximately the same, but population-wise, obviously, China is bigger.
But
so coming
the
up with
dollar
enough
value of our users is a lot higher than the dollar value of their users right now.
Right. So amassing that scale in order to have a counterweight and then engage in the dialogue, which frankly speaks to this other question. And believe me, the question of when do you engage Chinese counterparts is something that we encounter over and over and over again. It's a very fair question. And there are different philosophies on this, and I'd love to hear your view on this. There's one school of thought says that, look, from day one, engage the Chinese now. Then there's another school that says, including around the Magna Carta that we were discussing earlier in this event, that says, as transatlantic partners that have a value community, that have, with some dysfunctionality, but by and large successfully globalized together, let's get our act together first, and then we'll engage China. Where do you come out on that?
I am the world's worst negotiator. I just say thank you usually, and that's how I got to speak at this conference.
Yeah.
It really depends on how you think your negotiating leverage will change if you come out on the same page. Are you going to is having a much bigger market and a coordinated face going to give you a better bargaining position? And I just don't know enough about that in terms of engagement. Knowing what they're doing and engaging in talks versus negotiation, knowing what's going on is really important to know when to actually start becoming serious about talks.
Yeah.
So I guess what I would think.
Yeah. So far, we're seeing the United States taking a very strong adversarial stance. Europe, frankly, is a bit more fragmented on how to treat China, right? Countries like Germany are actually also sanctioning the equipment, but there are other countries that are in Europe that are having a hard problem with that, that are having a tough problem with that hard stance.
So one thing about the role of international cooperation, I think, is, and a framework is to really determine what domains are up for grabs to compete in. Which parts do you want to leave to the market, and which parts do you explicitly not want to leave to the market? And underlying principles for which parts you want to leave to which kind of market, that's something to be negotiated, I think. Because, for example, extreme case would be messing with humans, right? You're messing with DNA and improving people, et cetera. Nobody would disagree that bringing up something that's dysfunctional or non-functional in a person and regrowing their ability to do something, if they can't see, regrowing their parts of their eye to do that, that's fine. Enhancing extreme muscular dystrophy type things to get it full again, fine. But then why stop there? Why not go a little further so that your eyesight is beyond what most normal humans have? Why not go to the point where you're sort of enhanced people? Now, if you're going to agree that that kind of thing is off the market, because in the principle you can't do that. You can't start producing superhumans out of a certain region that can outcompete in stamina, cognitive ability, et cetera. Then we as the bigger the cooperative fabric, the less likely you are going to move in that way. But if that kind of thing isn't cooperated, it's up for grabs up to various market values of how much would you pay for your Olympic athletes, how much would you pay for normal kids to be able to go to places like Stanford more with a higher probability because they can think harder and faster and for a longer duration and focus more. So then it becomes an era of not just human behavior modification. There's human sort of functions, but also behavior. That's where we get into Cambridge Analytica, democracies that can be influenced by people's Facebook behavior, and then things that we saw happen. But there's probably a lot happening that's much more subtle than that we're not aware of, because the things that we are aware of are the ones that are either too big and they're a little bit clumsy. They learn the lessons from Cambridge Analytica. They've gone deeper. And so how much of people's behavior are you allowed to be influenced by that through agreements? That doesn't mean everybody will follow agreements, but having those kinds of cooperation with underlying principles can help, I think.
Okay. Final comment, Quentin?
Well, I just want to work through a couple of questions we can get to. What about the health and environmental damages? There really aren't any proven ones. Suggestions from dealing with Chinese students? Let them stay. Right? Corrupt them. Let them stay.
That's great.
There you go. The moral, if they see an incentive to stay here, they're not likely to spy because we'll kick them out.
It's a sad affair, right? I have Chinese students and frankly was interviewed on Chinese state media about this problem as well. Xi Jinping, neither Mr. Trump nor Mr. Xi did anybody a favor by sowing distrust, right? When Xi said, look, first and foremost, every Chinese citizen, no matter where they are a national security asset. Immediately, people anywhere, including entrepreneurs right here in Silicon Valley, are starting to become distrustful. That doesn't help anybody. And a lot of my students are afraid that they're going to get shunned, and that is a huge waste for cross-national understanding and really for innovation ecosystems. It's a horrible development, right? Now treating people, almost putting them into, mental camps. That person is Chinese, therefore they're a suspect, right?
Particularly
Horrible way to
certain
go.
histories of stereotyping we unfortunately have.
Very unfortunate. Exactly. Okay, final word from each one of you. If you're an entrepreneur sitting in the audience, or a student, or an executive, what's like the one piece of advice you would give them about this situation? What should they do? What should they learn next? What should they do next?
So I think understanding what what you're allowed and not allowed to do by the government, and trying to push the government to allow you to do more, and to understand what your risks are in dealing with upstream and downstream providers, not only in other countries, but around here. Just make sure you understand the incentives of them to take over your business or not, and what you can do with the government, and as he said, using the government as much as possible for your own advantage. That's what entrepreneurs should do. That may not be the best public policy, but that's the entrepreneur policy.
Thank you.
Well, I absolutely agree. Yeah. So, what's the core value added? What's the value you create? What are the rules and regulations around that value creation at the core that you're doing? How have those rules and regulations shifted over time? By looking at that, you can see where some of the leverage points were. And so once you figure out where some of the leverage points were, you can create a strategy to try to figure out where, when push comes to shove, you might be able to exercise it.
Okay, Quentin.
Well, this is a business advice. Very quick story. 100 years ago, it cost $1 to see Enrico Caruso, and it cost $1 to buy an Enrico Caruso record. Today, music is free, and Bruce Springsteen costs about $1,000 to see. My point is, y'all come to a meeting like this. You could have watched on YouTube. You could have listened to it while you're doing something else. The strange thing about the digital age is human moments are becoming more valuable. And you can see this also in the creation of things like personal trainers and therapists and chiropractors and all these things. People are paying more and more to have authentic human moments because there's so much digital information. So if you're looking for an edge, figure out a way to be the best possible human you can, and then bring that to the world.
All right, thank you very
That's the
much.
high-value activity.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank the panel. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to have to march off the stage, yeah. I'm going to close out. Thank you very much. If you could please take a seat up at the panel in the front row. We're going to close out now the conference. Thank you, Greg. And in just a moment, I'm going to ask the organizing team of the conference to come up here because I think we have to give them a big thank you. But before we get there, I would like to do just a few things to set us up sort of for what comes next. And the first one is the word cloud. If you could please launch your applications. And I'd like you to tell us now, having lived through this conference for the past 2 days, what are the kinds of solutions we should work on together? What are the kinds of ideas, the kinds of programs? Like anything concrete you might have? I know you're going to have to think hard about this, but if the last 2 days informed your thinking on where that potential is. Okay, stop spies. All right, okay. Yes, good. Cooperate. Education. Education's a big one. Okay. Listen, right? Talk. Listening is even more valuable, certainly. And we also need to listen to the Chinese. Get rid of Google. Wow. Okay. Some extreme views in the room. All right. Internships. Internships are always great to create rapport, right? Deregulation. Okay. Deregulation, maybe re-regulation. Let's see, privacy, trust, etc. Right? Connect. Data literacy, big one. How can we work together on data literacy? Could we start a new institution? Could we start platforms to create data literacy between our two regions? More exchanges. Okay. All right. Lots of ideas there. Education staying the top one, right? Do we need new educational programs? All right. Let's see what else. A few more. Okay. Communication, more connection. Maybe we need another one of these. Maybe next year, maybe 2 years from now, right? Whichever it may be, I am going to give you a charge, and that is, what is the one thing that you can imagine that you can do if this were to happen again next year, whether here or in Germany, or maybe it's 2 years, who knows, we'll see. What is the one thing you would contribute? What's the one concrete collaboration, idea, potential, program, concept that you can start as of tomorrow with somebody in the audience, right? Or maybe coming out of networking post-audience, something concrete you can bring to the next iteration of this conference. That is the charge, because hopefully there will be another one of these. And that gets me to close out and just point you to a couple of things. We will be writing a report jointly with Katharina and Lars that will be distributed to all of you, in which we will digest everything that happened here, pick up some of the themes we had in the white paper that we distributed. If you haven't seen the white paper, it's not necessarily something, it's only valuable before you come to a conference. Please do read it. We'd love to get your comments on it. Lots of facts and data in that. And of course, our conference report will build on that and mesh it with everything that was said here. Lastly, don't be strangers. Keep in touch with our organizers, our organizing team. Keep in touch with GABA. Keep in touch with us at Cambrian. Connect with me on LinkedIn if you like. I'm always open to that. But if you do, please tell me in a quick message that you were here at the conference, so I remember. And let's continue the dialogue. Okay, which now gets me to the final and most important point of the wrap-up, and that is to thank the organizing team. I have to tell you that I am privileged. I truly feel very privileged, and I'm passionate about the fact that they asked me to help and partner with them and with GABA, and they've done a phenomenal job. I have to tell you, I am truly inspired by these young people who did this for 2 years. Frankly, mostly by themselves, obviously with help of partners, but they're behind this. And the energy and determination and passion and the smartness, the intelligence makes me feel really good about the potential of transatlantic cooperation to settle all these problems. So let us have them come on up here, please. Let's come on up here, and please give them a warm round of applause. Of course, my pleasure. You guys did a great job.
You did a great job.
Thank you. Excellent. As we clap, let me point out we've got an AV team in the back. We've got the graphic artist over here. We've got our Slido people, right? Some of our interns over in the back. We've got Dan, we've got Tobias. There's a whole bunch more people in the room. This was a great team, and we had a lot of fun. We were remarking the energy yesterday at the party, at the dinner. It was special, and it truly is. I attend a lot of conferences, and I'm proud of these guys, so thank you for having us part of this. One more time, please give them a round of applause.
Lisa hat.
Okay.